Hello, welcome to my channel, or welcome back if you've been here before. My name is Beth Ann, and today I wanted to do a quick Friday Reads update. This is the Queer Lit Readathon Friday Reads update of what I've been reading this week. So I've finished a book for the Queer Lit Readathon, which was Written in the Stars by Alexandria Bellefleur, and I did a standalone review video of that book earlier this week, so I will link to that in the cards and or down below. And that was a lovely lighthearted romance. If anyone is looking to read one of those, I definitely really enjoyed that book and want other people to read it too. And then the other book I've been reading this week for the Queer Lit Readathon is Queer Palestine and the Empire of Critique by Saed Atshan, who's a professor of peace and conflict studies at Swarthmore College, which is located in Pennsylvania. And he's an anthropologist and is a queer Palestinian himself. And this book is amazing. It's also very hard to read because it's dealing with some really tough topics. I think that's important to do, I mean, just in general, but especially during Pride Month, because as much as, especially in the US, we tend to focus on the celebration of queerness during Pride. Pride Month, of course, comes out of protest, and so many queer folks are not able to be out and proud about their queerness. So I wanted to make sure that I was also learning and sitting with the seriousness and the heaviness of queer oppression during this Queer Lit Readathon. So I hope you're all excited. I just wanted to talk a little bit briefly about this book because since it is hard, I do take breaks from it, but I've read the first 70 pages, which encompasses the introduction and chapter 1. And so in the introduction, Dr. Atshan is sort of laying out his goals in writing this book and sort of what the book itself is. And then chapter 1 is sort of an introduction to the general topic. So it's called LGBTQ Palestinians and the Politics of the Ordinary. And so far what I've learned is Saed is sort of organizing the book around 3 distinct periods in the queer Palestinian movement. And so he's focused on the queer Palestinian movement within Israel and Palestine, and then also the global solidarity movement associated with the queer Palestinian movement locally. So he identifies 3 important time periods. So there's a time period before the emergence of the queer movement in Palestine, but I think he's working with sort of immediately before. Then there's the rise of the movement locally in 2002, and then internationally in 2009, and then a current period of sort of plateauing of the movement since 2012 up through 2020 when this book was published. And I think the title needs a little bit of explanation, and that's part of what he is setting up in the introduction in chapter 1. So this empire of critique term, I think, is a term that he developed for this book. And the idea there is that the critique of empire that's done by activists and thinkers, and so that's the critique of imperialism and everything that comes with imperialism, including homophobia, the critique of empires has been transformed, and here I'm quoting from him, transformed into an empire of critique in which queer Palestinians, and to a large extent many of their allies, find themselves under numerous overlapping regimes of surveillance, suspicion, and control. In this case, there's state surveillance, especially surveillance by Israel. There's surveillance from families and communities because Palestinian culture just sort of generally is very homophobic. And then there's surveillance from within queer communities and organizations, whereby some of the people who those communities and organizations are designed to support and protect feel pushed out and marginalized. And Atshan is asserting that this increasing critique from all directions, and especially sort of an increasing critique within the movement, has contributed to the plateau since 2012. So he sort of sets up that sort of overarching theme as he's going to kind of break down everything that's going on sort of in all of those overlapping, that idea of overlapping surveillance from sort of all sides. So then in chapter 1, and I think I mentioned, right, that the introduction, has sort of a subtitle, "There is no hierarchy of oppressions," drawing from, I believe, the Audre Lorde quote, that there is no hierarchy of oppressions. And so one of the main messages that Saed is building up in the early part of the book is that it really is impossible to divorce sexual liberation and sort of national and cultural liberation. And so sexual liberation in terms of rights for LGBTQ people and for women have to happen in concert with freedom for the Palestinian people as a whole. And part of the empire of critique issue is that there are divisions within the queer Palestinian movement, and we see this actually play out in many types of movements, where some people think that sort of that intersectionality should be put aside in pursuit of a single common goal. So in this case, it would be freedom from oppression by Zionism and Zionists, is more important and should be sort of prioritized. And discourse on LGBTQ rights and the push for LGBTQ rights should maybe take a backseat or a secondary priority compared to that one. And so as Saed is sort of building up these arguments in the first chapter, chapter 1, he's just giving us a lot of conceptual, contextual information. So we get a lot of information about homophobia in Palestine. We get a lot, and when I say Palestine, I'm meaning the occupied territories, because of course the whole region is historically Palestine. But yeah, so homophobia in the occupied territories, and homophobia that's often weaponized by Israel. So here's another quote from the book. "For decades, Israeli intelligence and security services have targeted queer Palestinians, used homophobia as a weapon, threatening to out them to their families and communities if they do not serve as informants and collaborators." Then he also defines some other important terms. So term pinkwashing, which is defined as a discourse on Israeli LGBTQ rights aimed at detracting attention from violations of Palestinian human rights. So he has a section describing how Israel, and in particular Tel Aviv, deliberately brands itself with targeted, orchestrated marketing plans to appear LGBTQ friendly. And the sort of, like, okay, LGBTQ friendliness is great. Like, we need to know which cities are safe for people to go on vacation in, on that level, okay. But part of the problem is that it is a pretty explicit campaign to characterize Israel as a place where queer people can be safe, and to characterize Palestine as sort of a backwards, uncivilized place where being queer is much more dangerous and homophobia is much more widespread. So that's sort of a problem thinking about coloniality. And then it's also just sort of erasing the whole range of experience and identities that people have in both places. And in particular, it's falsely simplifying and erasing intersectionality in the Palestinian context, because you sort of can't entangle homophobia from a system in which people are oppressed and without power. Homophobia really thrives in those situations. And then the cycle, all of this sort of perpetuates as a cycle, because once you have Israel sort of pushing LGBTQ awareness, you have further stigmatization of queerness in Palestinian society, because then there's an association of homosexuality with betrayal and collaboration with the oppressors. So it's sort of, that's a bit of a perpetuating cycle. And then the geography of what's going on plays a huge part too, Atshan describes. So queer organizations are openly active in Israel, and even the two big Palestinian queer organizations have their headquarters and much of their activities in Israel, because it's where it's safer to be out and safer to organize. And they do reach out to and try to incorporate people in the occupied regions as much as possible, but it's still the voices and the experience of people in Gaza and the West Bank are left out, and they don't have access to access these resources and the communities of these queer groups in Israel, and then also international aid, international funding for LGBTQ rights and events and development goes to organizations based in Israel. And so it's, again, limited access to queer people who live in the occupied territories. Yeah, and so those are just some of the things that Saed is sort of unpacking in the early parts of the book, and there's a lot more. There's a lot going on, and I'm just sort of picking out things that felt sort of particularly salient to me. But just sort of wrapping back around to the idea of the hierarchy of oppression, since that is sort of a big umbrella theme of the early part of the book. And Saed mentions the Palestinian feminist movement, which has, at least in his eyes, been incredibly clear about rejecting the notion that you can prioritize different oppressions. So really rejecting the idea that gender justice should wait until after Palestine is free. And so sort of calling for the same treatment for LGBTQ rights. And he includes a quote from the leader of one of the Palestinian LGBTQ organizations that I really liked. So that person had said, "Part of how I see and understand resistance is that when we decolonize Palestine, I will have a society that I can rely on, a society that is ready to respond to different social and political processes, that can respect the other and have openness about different sexuality and behavior." So for a queer person, I mean, that's why you can't divorce sort of the national political level of freedom from having your rights respected and protected, because, you know, it's only a partial gain to have sort of one type of freedom when you're still not sort of accepted and welcome in the society that results. So yeah, no hierarchy of oppressions. And then just a couple lovely quotes. So this is one quote. So this is Saed speaking, just him writing. He says, "Queerness is where we can expand rather than limit the spaces of possibility for self and collective expression and engagement with the world." So I really liked that one. And then he has a long passage, a page or two of writing, but talking about the idea of being in the closet and how that doesn't seem to reflect sort of the queer Palestinian experience, or at least some queer Palestinian experiences. So he's quoting a former leader of one of the queer Palestinian organizations who said that the collective movement out of the closet and into the space of the nation. This person says that queer Palestinian activism sort of is not the collective movement out of the closet and into the space of the nation, but the creation of a space outside the state's regulatory gaze and beyond the reach of its checkpoints, where bodies, desires, and identifications, queer or not, might proliferate in all their perverse and incoherent glory. And then a little further down, Atshan writes that others prefer to think about disclosure in terms of inviting in which LGBTQ Palestinians reveal aspects of themselves and their sexuality in a methodical, patient, and individual fashion, and only with those with whom they have established trust and a sense of security. In this context, queer Palestinians have used the term dance to describe what it is like to navigate a world in which the boundaries between disclosure and non-disclosure and between legibility and non-recognition require constant vigilance, recalibration, and flexibility. The spatial and temporal limits of the notion of the closet become evident. That is, many do not experience a teleological transition from one geographic positioning to another and from one period to another. The spaces overlap, the times are blurred, and the traumas are triggered when they must retreat or when they see another queer person they care about suffer. Queer Palestinians rarely feel that they are truly fully out of any closet, and life becomes a series of dances, alone or in a community, to survive, thrive, and find love and acceptance. So I really liked that sort of reframing or redefining of that general idea that part of you is hidden and buried away from sort of your society and the people who love you, and just a different definition than than the in the closet imagery that we in the US tend to use much more. And I think that, you know, that idea, like he's talking about sort of the dance that people go through. And I think, you know, at least like for myself and for other queer people that I know, that, you know, when people talk about being in the closet versus not, for a lot of people, it is much more nuanced and is a bit more of that dance, because you're not always out all the time to all the people that you're encountering. And so you're sort of weaving your own path. But it's particularly salient and moving thinking about in the Palestinian context because the culture and society is incredibly homophobic, more homophobic than at least many places that I have been and where the queer people who I know have been. And so the potential of that inviting in seems a little bit greater, and then of course the costs of that going wrong are so much greater than in the places that I live anyway. So that's just a little bit of what I'm finding attractive and compelling about this book so far. This book is amazing. It is beautifully written. It is sort of an anthropological text, but it is written in much more of sort of a storytelling way. And Saed does classify it early on as sort of an autoethnography. So he is he interviewed a lot of people for this, spent a lot of time living in Palestine and doing research. And so you see that backbone coming through, but then he is basing a lot of it sort of in his own experience as a queer Palestinian man. And just really sort of weaving it together so it doesn't read as a dry academic text. It's really quite enjoyable to read. So with that, I think I've talked long enough, but I'm really enjoying my Queer Lit Readathon reads. I'm obviously going to continue with this, and then I have another queer romance, American Fairytale by Adriana Herrera, which I have just started and is amazing because she's a phenomenal writer. So I'm going to be interspersing those two things. So I have something lighthearted and then something that is making me learn and grow. So I hope you're all enjoying reading, whatever you're reading, and I'll see you all in the next video. Thanks. Bye.